Maaser chapter 7. 1. Following the laws apply when a person has 100 lug of wine that are tevel according to scriptural law. If he says the 2 lug that I will separate are truma, 10 are the first tithe, and the 9 are the second tithe. You should not begin drinking and leave over the quantity designated as truma, and the tithes at the end. Instead, you should make the separations and then drink. We do not say that the wine left over at the end is retroactively considered as if it was set aside at the beginning. The rationale for the stringency is the obligation to separate Torah and the tithes is scriptural in origin. With regard to matters of scriptural law, we do not say that we consider as if a separation has been made unless it has actually been made too. When a person sacrifices his tithe, when a person specifies that his tithe is located at the opening of a jug of wine, you should not drink from the bottom of the barrel. He specifies there at the top of that you're at the bottom, you should not drink from the top. The rationale is that the liquids intermingle. If, by contrast, one specifies that the tithe is for produce with the opening of a storage container, one may eat from the bottom. If one specifies the bread located at the bottom, one may eat from the top. 3. A person can designate certain produce as the second tithe and then redeem it afterwards. You can designate that same produce as the first tithe for this batch of produce or Thomas Maaser for other produce. 4. When a person decides produce to use them for the separation of tithes, he may continue to separate tithes relying on this produce on the assumption that it is intact, eating and drinking from the produce from which he intends to separate tithes until the entire quantity that was set aside has become tithes. He then gives that to a Levite. If later he discovers the produce that he set aside for tithes has been lost, he must show concern for all the tithes that he set aside. He should not, however, tithe the second time with certainty. 5. When a person lends money to a priest, a Levite, or poor person so that he can separate produce for the money that they owe from the portions due them, he may continue to separate tithes on their behalf on the assumption they are alive. He need not show concern that the priest or Levite died or the poor man became wealthy. 6. How should he make the separations on their behalf? He should separate from the first tithe or the tithe for the poor, give that to another person for the sake of the priest, Levite, a poor person to whom he lent money. If the debtors would frequently take these separations from him, or if he was accustomed to give these separations to them alone, he need not give them to another person on their behalf. After the lender makes the separations, he calculates the worth of the produce he separates and deducts it from the loan. He continues doing this until he repays the entire debt. He may sell the truma to any priest of his choice and then may partake of the tithes himself. 7. When he calculates the worth of the produce that he set aside, he has the right to consider their value according to the lower market price. This is not considered as interest. The banker does not remit such a debt. If the lender desires to nullify this arrangement, he may not. But if the borrower seeks to do so, they may. If the owner despaired of receiving payment from them, he can no longer make these separations on their behalf. We may not make separations because of a debt that was lost. If a priest, Levite, or a poor person who borrowed money dies, he cannot continue to separate on their behalf unless he receives permission from the heirs. Moreover, even if permission is granted, it is effective only when the deceased left the heirs a tract of land, at least the size of a needle. If, however, he left them only money, permission from their heir is not effective. If he made a loan in court on the condition that he will make the separations on their behalf for this money, it is not necessary for him to receive permission from the heirs. If the poor person became wealthy, he may no longer separate the tithe for the poor on his behalf, even though he made a loan in court. The recipient may retain the funds in his possession. 8. When an Israelite tells a Levite, I am in possession of a core of tithes for you, the Levite has the right to designate that produce as Maaser for other produce, even if he did not draw it into his possession. If the Israelite gives it to another Levite, the first individual has nothing more than complaints against him. 9. When a person has produce in a silo and gives a sa'ah to a Levite and a sa'ah to a poor person, he should not set aside 8 sa'ah from the sa'ah and partake of it unless he knows with certainty that the 2 sa'ah of the tithes are still intact. If, however, the Levite and or the poor person partook of them, he may set aside only an amount of great proportionate to what remains of the 2 sa'ah. 10. Following law applies when poor people exchange the presents given them with the owner of the field, i.e., they give him a sa'ah of lekach shechamper, or the tithes for the poor, and they took a sa'ah of grain from the grain pile. The grain he takes from them is exempt from the tithes, even though it was prepared in the domain of the owner. The tithes must be separated from the grain they take from him, even though it was given in exchange for their presents that are exempt. 11. The following laws apply when there are 2 baskets of hevel from which tumah was separated in front of a person. He says, let the tithes from this one be in that one, and the tithing of the first basket is effective. The person says, the tithes from this one be in the other one, the tithes from the second basket in the first one. Tithing of the first basket is effective for he establishes the tithes within the second basket. The tithe of the second basket is not effective because the tithe cannot be set aside from the first basket because the obligation to tithe has already been discharged from the second basket, from which tithes from both must be separated. 12. If one says with regard to the tithes for these 2 baskets, tithes for each one are established in the other, he has designated the tithes by name and has established the tithes within them. He therefore separates the tithes only. He separates tithes from them. He may not separate the tithes from another source. 13. How are the tithes separated in the above situation? One may separate the tithes from both of them, from one of them, or he should separate the tithes from each one of them from itself if they were of equal size. If one of them is larger than the other, one should separate the tithes from the larger one from the smaller one, the tithes from the smaller one from the larger one. Maaser chapter 8. 1. produce from which great truma and trumas maaser have been separated are referred to as ordinary produce. When the other tithes have been separated from it, it is universally called ordinary produce that has been made acceptable. 2. Following laws apply when tevel becomes mixed together with the same species of ordinary produce that has been made acceptable, in which instance the tevel cannot be considered insignificant because its flavor cannot be detected. If he has other produce, he should separate the trumas maaser and the tithes from the tevel for the tevel according to the appropriate reckoning. If he does not have other produce from which to make the separations for that tevel, the entire mixture becomes forbidden until he makes separations from it. When he makes these separations, he forfeits a portion from the ordinary produce that has been made acceptable as equivalent to the term maaser that must be separated from the tevel. 3. What is implied? 100 saw of tevel is mixed with 100 saw of ordinary produce that has been made acceptable. He should separate 101 from the entire mixture. Everything that he sets aside is considered as tevel. Thus, 99 saw of ordinary produce that has been made acceptable remain. He has thus lost a saw of the ordinary produce. Similarly, if the truma has not been separated from the tevel, he must forfeit an amount from the ordinary produce that has been made acceptable that is equivalent to the truma and trumas maaser to be separated from the tevel. Why must he forfeit this saw? So that he will not say the 100 saw that I set aside are ordinary produce and the 100 saw that remain are tevel. Similarly, if the amount of the tevel exceeded or was less than the ordinary produce, one should separate an amount equivalent to the tevel and an amount from the ordinary produce equivalent to the trumas maaser to be separated from the tevel, or equivalent to the truma and trumas maaser to be separated if it was tevel from which truma was not separated. 4. Similarly, if tithes that were tevel became mixed with ordinary produce that has been made acceptable, even the slightest amount caused the mixture to be prohibited. If the person has other tithes, you should make a separation for the trumas maaser for the tithes that require this according to the appropriate proportion. If he does not have other tithes, he should remove the tithes and forfeit from the ordinary produce that has been made acceptable an amount equal to the trumas maaser in the tithes. 5. What is implied? 100 saw of tithes become mixed with 100 saw of ordinary produce that has been made acceptable. He should separate 110 saw from the entire mixture. Everything he separates considered as the tithes. The 90 saw that remain are ordinary produce as before. Similarly, if the amount of the ordinary produce exceeds or is less than that of these tithes, you should separate the tithes from the ordinary produce and the amount equivalent to the trumas maaser in the tithe. 6. The following was applied when tevel becomes mixed together with the tithes that were tevel. If the amount of tevel was equivalent to the amount of tithes, you must forfeit from the tevel an amount equivalent to the maaser. It contains what is implied. There were 100 saw of tevel became mixed with 100 saw of tithe. You separate 101 saw that are considered as tithes. The 99 remaining are considered as tevel. If there's more tevel than tithe, he should separate the tithes alone, and he does not forfeit anything for the tevel. For if he would designate trumas maaser of the tevel, the tithes would be meduma, a mixture of the tithes, and trumas maaser from the tithes, which are separated together. If there were more tithes than tevel, he should separate the trumas maaser and the tevel, setting aside tevel and an amount equivalent to the trumas maaser for the tevel, i.e., 1/100th of the tithe. The tevel should be considered as if it is all the truma and sold to a priest, with the exception of the worth of the 2 portions of truma in it. Thus, he will forfeit 1/100th of the tithe, which is equivalent to the trumas maaser and tevel. What is applied to 100 saw tevel with 200 saw of tithe? You should set aside 103. The 3 saw are the Maaser of the 100 saw of tevel, and the measure of the Maaser for the 200 saw of the tithe. The separation is necessary. The people will not come to error if the tithes become mixed with an equivalent amount of tevel. Therefore, you should leave 197 saw, which will remain tithed as they were. 7. The following laws apply when a person has a stack with 10 lines, each containing 10 barrels of wine, and the owner allocated 1 barrel of the outer line as tithes for other wine, but he does not know which outer line he intended. He should take 2 barrels from the corners on diagonal, mix them, and separate the tithes from them. 8. If he allocated 1 barrel from the half of the outer line as tithes, but does not know which outer half a row, he should take 4 barrels, 1 from each of the corners. If he allocated a barrel from one row but does not know which row, he should take a barrel from a diagonal row. If he allocated a barrel from half a row but he does not know which half a row, he should take a barrel from 2 diagonal rows. Thus, he'll be taking a barrel from each half row. He should then mix them together and separate the tithes. 9. If he allocated 1 barrel as tithes but he does not know which barrel it is, he should take some wine from each of the 100 barrels, mix together, and separate enough for 1 barrel as tithes. Maaser, chapter 9. 1. In the age of Yochanan the high priest, who served after Shimon the just, the high court sent emissaries to search throughout the entire territory of Israel. They discovered that everyone was careful with regard to the great truma and would separate it with regard to the first tithe, the second tithe, and the tithe for the poor. The common people among Israel would be lax and would not separate it. Therefore, the sages decreed that only the word of trustworthy people should be relied upon with regard to tithes. The status that opposed to the common people, by contrast, is doubtful. We do not rely on them. If they say that they separate the tithes, this is called demai. 2. They ordained that a person should separate trumas maaser from the demai, for it is a transgression. Should separate only trumas maaser from the demai, for it is a transgression punishable by death, and the second tithe, for there is no loss in doing so. since the owner partakes of it. One need not, however, separate the first tithe of the tithe of the poor from the because the obligation is doubtful, and whenever one desires to expropriate the property from a colleague, the burden of proof is on him. Therefore, he tells the Levite or the poor person bring proof that it is not tithe, and then take the tithes. 3. Even though one does not separate the tithe of the poor from the it is necessary to designate it without separating it. One says, a tenth of what is here is for the tithe for the poor. This is done to firmly establish the obligation of the second tithe. For the tithe of the poor is given in the third and sixth years instead of the second tithe given in the other years of the sabbatical cycle. 4. When Trumas Maaser in the second tithe is separated from the a blessing is not recited because the obligation was instituted because of a doubt. Therefore, it is permitted to separate it when one is naked. 5. How should tithe be separated from the One should set aside an amount equivalent to the measure of Trumas Maaser, i.e., 1/100th of the entire amount, to place next to the produce and say, "This is the tithe, as is the remainder of the tithes that are adjacent to it." He then says, "This portion which I first set aside as the tithe is from a Maaser for the remainder of the tithes that are adjacent to it." He then takes it and gives it to a priest. The order is required because as an initial and prefatory measure, it is permitted to separate the Maaser before the tithes themselves. Afterwards, he should separate the second tithe. 6. It is permissible to set aside the second tithe before the first tithe when tithing demai. If one desires, he should say, "The second tithe of this produce is located in the northern portion or the southern portion of the produce, and its holiness is transferred to this money." Similarly, a person who purchases a loaf of bread from the baker should separate from it the amount to be separated as Tumas Maaser and as Chala, and say, "The 1/100th of the total that is here is part of the tithe as well as the remainder of the tithes that are next to it. May this portion that is set aside as tithe serve as the Tumas Maaser for the remainder of the tithes that are next to it. The remainder of what is set aside that exceeds the 1/100th in total is Chala, and the second tithe in its northern or southern portion, and its holiness is transferred to this money. He may then partake of the bread. 7. Similarly, a person who invites a colleague to dine with him on the Shabbos, and the guest does not trust the host with regard to the separation of the tithes, the guest should do the following. On Friday, he should say, "The produce that I will separate tomorrow is part of the tithes, as is the remainder of the tithes which are adjacent to it. That portion which is first designated as the tithes is Tumas Maaser for the remainder which is adjacent to it. The second tithe in its northern or southern portion, and its holiness is transferred to this money." This is permitted because a person may make such stipulations with regard to the ma, even though it is not in his possession. When, however, we are certain the tithes have not been separated, he may make stipulations only concerning produce that is in his possession. 8. What is implied if on Friday he had 100 figs that were tevel in his home, and he is in his house of study or in the field, and he's afraid the night will fall and he will not be able to tithe the produce on the Sabbath. On the Shabbos, he should say, "The 2 figs that I will separate are truma, 10 that I will separate after them are the first tithe, and the 9 that I will separate after them are the second tithe." On the morrow, he makes the separation, but then partake of the figs. 9. He must whisper inaudibly the appropriate statement when he is making the separations one after the other. He is not considered as making article fit for use on Shabbos because he made the stipulation previously. When such stipulation has been made concerning Tevel, is permitted to move it on the Shabbos even before the separation were made. He should focus his attention on a portion of the produce, designating it as truma, the tithes, and partake of the remainder. 10. If a common person gave him a cup of wine to drink on the Shabbos, he should say, "What I will leave in the bottom of the cup as part of the tithes, as is the remainder of the tithes which are adjacent to it. That portion which are first designated as the tithes is Tumas Maaser for the remainder which is adjacent to it. The second tithe is located on the brim of the cup, and its holiness is transferred to the money. He may then drink the cup, leaving a portion equivalent to the amount to be separated from Maaser in the bottom of the cup." 11. Similarly, if a colleague invites him to drink on the Shabbos, he should make such stipulation on Friday with regard to everything that he will desire to partake of at his home. Similarly, when a worker does not trust his employer with regard to the tithing of the food that he is given, he should take 1 fig and say, "This and 9 which are follow are considered as tithes for the 100 that I will eat. This is what is considered as Tumas Maaser for the 10 that follow. 10 that follow after that are considered as the second tithe, and their holiness is transferred to this money." He takes the fig that he set aside and gives it to the priest. The worker should separate the money for the second tithe from his own funds. For it is a condition of the court that Tumas Maaser should come from the employer and the second tithe from the worker. 12. Our sages did not obligate bakers to separate the second tithe from grain that is mild and Tumas Maaser to separate. It is separated in a state of ritual putting together with the chal. The purchaser must separate the second tithe. When does the above apply? To one who sells at a store, or to the entrance to the store. Whoever he sells to a wholesale baker or to a store adjacent to a wholesale baker, he is obligated to separate the second tithe as well. 13. The following was applied when 2 people harvested in their vineyards into a common vat, and one of them is not trusted with regard to the tithes, even though the one who is trusted with regard to the tithes already tithes his own produce. When he takes his portion of the wine, he is obligated to separate tithes as one does for demai for the portion of the common person. 14. What is implied? If there were equal partners, and one takes 200 lug as his portion, he should separate 1 lug as Tumas Maaser and 10 lug as the second tithe for the 100 lug of the common person. For that, this is all that is required. We already separated the tithes for the produce that was definitely not tithe for half of the entire quantity of the vat. Similarly, if his share was a third or a fourth, he must separate the tithe from the produce he takes proportionally.